Well, hello everybody. My name's Chris Dew, and I head up the PopDoc product management team here at E1. But today we're actually not going to talk very much about PopDoc. Really, we have a series of webinars that we're doing just to provide some greater education around some of the technologies and concepts that are coming up that are becoming more and more increasingly part of our everyday lives in the ERP and CRM and business application space. So today's focus is really on the Azure Data Lake and understanding the costs of what it takes to run a data lake. So we're going to jump right in. We're going to be very hands-on in this webinar, and actually in the upcoming webinars as well, which I'll highlight at the end. But we really want to give you the tools that you can understand. And again, if you're a partner, quoting things for your customers, giving them the right perspective on what it's going to cost to actually run a data lake. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Pricing, that's what we're talking about. So really, how much is a data lake going to cost? And here comes the answer. It depends. The worst answer in the world, right? Nobody wants that. We want to know exactly what it's going to cost. So what does it depend on? It depends on the amount of data you're going to store. That is certainly something that factors into the costs. It depends on how often that you'll be accessing that data, whether from a reporting standpoint, or again, the flip side of that, how often are we going to be writing new data to that storage place. So that is also something that factors into the pricing of this. Another thing will be how fast the data needs to be retrieved, right? There's different purposes that we may have for this data. Sometimes it may be like immediate needs to pull that data back. Maybe it's inside of an existing or the new system and being able to see some history, very, very quickly. For some other people, it may be more of a research type of scenario, right? Where maybe it's something that isn't accessed very often at all, but it's just saying, okay, we need to go do some research into some history data that was sitting out there in the data lake. So there are some cost considerations on that as well. We're going to talk about backup strategy, really, right? Where your data is stored. Is it important to have this data also stored in another geography, right? Whether it be in the same country, potentially at a different data center, or maybe even off in another country as well, just to make sure that you have a backup. And again, we'll talk about the cost implications of that as well. And then finally, one of the things that does drive costs is hierarchical data. So there's a mouthful right there, but basically all that means is when you have a structure to the data, so folders, so you don't keep everything in one gigantic folder. You have something that says, hey, maybe it's a company specific or year specific or things like that. So we'll talk about some of those scenarios as well. But these are all some factors that are going to determine how much it's going to cost. So I haven't given you any numbers yet. How do we get to some numbers? Well, this is where Microsoft's Azure calculator comes in. And so what does this calculator do for me, right? What does it actually do? So first thing, it may scare you. This is one of those things, I think, for a lot of people, the first time they fire it up and they put some information in there, they go, whoa, you told me it might be this amount, but it's telling me way more than that. And so some of their defaults that they have inside of there, if you don't change those to be more realistic for your customer or your scenario, it may scare you. So I'm here to help you not be scared. And again, part of that is this calculator will give you some pretty good estimates of what the costs may be. So I want to spend the bulk of today really getting into this tool that all of you will have access to, and helping you walk through it and understand it to help you estimate that amount of data in there. So let's jump right into it. Let me flip over. Okay. Again, if you just search for Azure Calculator or Azure Pricing Calculator, it'll take you to this page, the pricing calculator. And you can do this not only for what I'm going to focus on today, right, which is going to be on the data lakes portion, but you can do this for all kinds of Azure resources. So this can be a utility that you have. But let's jump right into data lakes. So again, this is a storage account. I wasn't going to get too much into the setup and configuration. That's going to be on tomorrow's session. But today we're going to just focus on the pricing of it. And again, just very briefly, it is a storage account that we're going to be configuring. So once we click on that up above, you're going to see that we have our estimate starting down below. So if we look at this, you can see the initial thing when we bring this down, we're sitting at $52. Okay, so we're gonna keep watching this number because it's gonna go up and down depending on the options that we choose inside of here. So first thing, I'm just gonna comment on some of the regions, right? Currently we have three, like on the E1 side of things for PopDoc, we have three different geographies where we host host our Azure data centers. And they are the North Central US, we have Western Europe and Australia. We're going to be bringing on Canada and additionally the UK as some additional Azure data centers very soon. So why am I asking you that or telling you that? Is because you will most likely want to put your data lake nearest to where you're going to be accessing it. And so in that case, right, if you're in the US, you would choose the north central US because that's where we have our where we have our services running, and you'll get the fastest speed because it'll be coming from the same data center. So that's not gonna really move the needle on this one, but I just wanted to bring that up. Okay, the second thing, we are talking about different types of storage accounts. Now, again, more than one of these potentially could work, depending on the options you're using. I'm gonna recommend using this Data Lake Storage Gen 2. This is the most flexible and handles every scenario that we need. So once we click on that, again, it didn't matter. It didn't really make any changes. Now, this is the first thing that actually would move the needle, right? So we have a standard and a premium tier. If I go from standard to premium, you'll see that jumps pretty drastically, right? From 52 to 210 in this case. In all of my testing, and we've tested with some really large data sets and again, just huge amounts of transactions, I have not seen any performance improvements, I guess, by choosing the premium. So for now, I'm recommending that most people go with the standard tier. But I just want to point that out. That is one of those things that does move the needle, right? Again, in our case, is approximately 4 times what we're at. Okay, we only get one option there. Now we start getting into the options of access tiers. Now, if you're like me, trying to maybe save some money or whatever, this is where the conversation comes in. How often are you going to be working with the data, right? So if you say, well, this is really for research purposes only, I'm really only going to, do it maybe once every 3 months or something like that, that I need to go dig up something. Then I think the temptation would be to go to like an archive type of scenario or cool. Here's where I'm going to steer you away from that. All the calculations that I've seen, it actually will go up. So, okay, let's look at this, right? Hot, we're at hot storage right now. If we change it to cool goes down, right? That brings us down a little bit. And so again, it's going to slow down the access. That might be something you'll do, but watch this. What if we choose archive? Archive actually goes up. This is kind of interesting because it's kind of a back burner where there's maybe more manual processes that need to run to actually get the data. So for my my purposes, I'm going to recommend that you do hot. It's going to give you the fastest access to your data if you're going to be using it at any frequency. Okay, here's the next thing that moves the needle. This is basically the backup policy, right? So right now, by default, this is a locally redundant backup. What you're going to get by default at the same data center, right, where your data lake is stored, it's automatically backed up. Now, this is where the costs come in, is if you want a more globally redundant, globally, or sorry, I should say geo redundant, right? So basically saying, I want a backup of this data outside of the data center where everything else is. So it's just, again, depending on the policies that people may have, just saying that, yep, we're willing to pay for that, but you'll see basically it's going to double. And again, you're basically paying for twice the amount, right? You're doing it twice. So that's really what you need to understand about that. Again, for a lot of people, they may, if they are archiving their data, right, like maybe coming from an ERP system like Dynamics GP or Dynamics SL or Dynamics Nav, or again, various host of other ones out there, is that oftentimes they may have the final SQL backup stored somewhere else as well. So just in case they ever needed to get that, they could do it again. But for some people, again, they really want to maintain a redundancy outside of the data center just in case a catastrophic event happened there. But again, my whole point here is that it will double your costs if you start going with a global or geo-redundant option. Okay, and here's the last one. We talked about this briefly before, but we're recommending most people do a hierarchical namespace. All the stuff that we're doing oftentimes is we're splitting stuff into companies, or even, we're going to get into this a bit more, but getting into the optimization of where do we put stuff in like really huge files, because sometimes we put those in different folders to make it a little more accessible, which we're gonna come back to in just a couple seconds here. So again, while if you did choose flat namespace, you'll see it goes way down. We need that for most cases. I would recommend it that you not just store everything in one folder, that you actually are able to you're able to have a structure to it. Okay, so we're sitting, after all these options that we've chosen, we're sitting at $52 a month. But this is where we start getting into, why does it cost $52 a month? And that is, the first assumption is that you have 1,000 gigabytes, right? A terabyte of data in here. Now, for most of the scenarios that we've seen, people do not have nearly that amount of data, right? A lot of people only have, 10 gigs or 100 gigs, or again, we've got a few larger ones that are in the 500 gigs, and I've only seen a handful of people over a terabyte of data that they're storing out there, but it is possible. So I just want you to understand, again, if you only have 100 terabytes of data instead of, sorry, 100 gigabytes of data instead of a terabyte, well, now that just reduced the cost a little bit on there. So I'm going to make an assumptions. We're just going to say we have 100 gigabytes of data, which is a lot. That's a fair amount of data up there. Okay, I guess just one highlight to look at here. We're literally looking at the storage cost is $2 a month, right, for the storage. So the storage is really pretty cost effective at 100 gigabytes. But then you'll see, if we just take a quick peek at this transactions section, this is only 70 cents on this estimate. Well, what does this comprise of? So you can see we talk about write operations. And here's what I'm basically going to, I'm going to say a couple things on this. This is for, if we look at this, 100,000 writes to the data lake is going to cost you 65 cents a month. Now, most people, how they're using this, right, they're archiving some data, and so they don't typically have an ongoing amount of writes, right? You may have the initial number of writing the files if you're archiving your data from, like I said, from GP or NAV or SL or some other system, and you might be moving it up there initially, but you're not going to be doing that afterwards. And so the writes is not something most people are going to be concerned about. Let's move on to the reads, right? We have the same kind of thing, right? For 100,000 reads of the data, we're looking at 5 cents a month. So you can see very, very minimal costs on this. Now, I'm going to spell out one thing since we're digging in deep on the costs on this. If you have a sharp eye, you can see that it has the read operations. Now, one interesting technical part of a data lake is that each read only is 4 megabytes. So it's basically broken up into little bits. So why do I spell this out? If you're pulling down a file that's 100 megabytes, that is the equivalent of 25 reads. So that's just one little thing I want to point out is that again, if you've dumped all of your transactions and for I don't know, sales orders or something like that, and it's sitting in a 100 megabyte file, and you read that, then it counts as 25 reads. Now again, you get 100,000 of them for 5 cents, so we're still talking it's pretty cost effective in there. But I just want to spell that out as we've seen some people with getting into not only hundreds of megabytes, but actually gigabytes file sizes that have just millions upon millions of transactions in some of their files. And so we have seen some scenarios where, and I'm just going to briefly mention this here. We're going to come back to it in the next coming days, but we do have some optimizations that we built into PopDoc to help with this. And so what we do oftentimes is when we find scenarios like that where they have huge amounts of transactions, and maybe you're pulling it back by customer or vendor, or maybe it's a date range, is we have a way of splitting these files out into their own little files and folders, so that instead of reading a gigabyte file to find 3 transactions for a particular vendor, we can actually pull just a really tiny file that has those 3 transactions in. So again, it saves you a little bit of a cost. But again, my whole point on this is even for 100,000 operations of this, it's 5 cents. So it's a really cost-effective thing. Okay, I'm going to skip this part for now, but let's go down to here, because look at this. This is really where most of our costs are coming from. So why we need to understand why. And so let's jump into this. So the big thing, again, I'm not going to focus on these. These are just a couple of small little pieces. And again, you can see the costs are minimal, except for this last one in the calculator, and that is metadata storage. So what is that? Why is this spelled out, and why does it cost $30? So this is interesting because this is data about the data inside of the data in your data lake. Oh, there you go. How to say data 3 different ways. And so what does that mean, right? It's the information about the files in there. It's information about the folders that you've set up. And so again, even if you had 1,000 folders inside of there, and each folder had 100 files, and that's such minimal information that you're never going to have a terabyte of information about a terabyte of data in there, right? It's always going to be a fraction of that. So I'm bringing this way down to, well, I'm just saying a gig, which I think is actually absolutely ridiculous as well, because you're not going to have a gigabyte of information about your folder structures and your files. But even if I move it down to a gig, it's down to 3 cents. And so really what I wanted to point out is if we look at the total at the end of this, right, for 100 gigabytes of probably, again, 100,000 accesses of a file each month, which again, in our studies, we have people they're not typically doing nearly that much, right? A lot of people are, and let me say this, a lot of times you may initially, as you're going from one system to another, you may initially be hitting that historical data a little bit more, but I think that starts falling off, after 2-3 years, that then that data becomes less and less relevant, and maybe it becomes more research, a few years in, until maybe after 7 years, you actually don't even need to access that history anymore. So just those are some points to point out. But here's my whole point on this, right? This estimate is saying $4.16 for 100 gigabytes of data. And again, even if you want to put a buffer on there saying it's 10 or even say 20, right? $20 a month, you have basically a great place to store your data and access it in a very reasonable way. Okay, so hopefully that has maybe just reduced the mystery a little bit of the demo lake or the data lake um, pricing, because I think so many people get really confused and they're like, hey, I hit the calculator and it says it's going to be $500 a month. And I typically tell people, 20 is fine. Or again, I know some people want to just maybe create a buffer for themselves and say, hey, for $50 a month, you should probably be able to handle most scenarios. Okay, so I just showed you the calculator, but we all live in the real world, right? So what does it really cost, right? So again, there's the title of my next slide. What does a data lake really cost? So I thought I would give you a real world scenario for E1, and this was a couple of years ago when we had just really gotten into the data lake scenario and helping people, migrate their data. And one of the biggest things that we do, right, is we had hundreds of test cases that we did. We had got some data in from other customers that we were able to run sample migrations on, and all of a sudden we had done hundreds of these, and we had them sitting in our data lake, and we had okay, so maybe before I get into the specifics here, we've been doing it for a year, and I hadn't really looked at our costs, our Azure costs internally, as we had been doing all this. And every once in a while I get a little worried because we get yelled at if the costs are going too crazy and too many Azure servers or things like that. So I'm like, you know what? I better check and see what we're actually costing the company. So I looked for the last 12 months. And again, here's a scenario like I told you. We've done hundreds of migrations in there. We had hundreds of gigabytes of data sitting in this data lake. And what was the final cost for 12 months? It was $4.58 for 12 months. So just to give you some perspective on this, right, for many, many people, we are really talking about very, very minimal costs for being able to actually store this data and be able to access it. So I hope that this, again, just clears up the mystery on that so many people do have, and you're able to see some value in there. Okay, I'm going to do a quick little recap, and then I'm going to get into questions. So I think there's at least one question out there right now, but if you do have some additional questions, go ahead. I'd encourage you to use the questions pane, and we'll get to those. So a quick little recap, right? I would encourage you to try to estimate the amount of data, and again, the number of accesses you may have, or again, how often people will be needing to see that particular information, to kind of, before you even get into the calculator, to have some data to put in there, right? I was using like 100 gigabytes as an example, but again, we had somebody that had 1.6 terabytes of data. And so it's those kinds of things, kind of knowing where you're coming from and what you're going to be storing, and again, how much you'll access it. Additionally, again, I would encourage you to use the Azure pricing calculator. I think it's a really nice tool that starts giving you a good start, and just kind of nailing down down those costs and giving you at least an estimate before you actually do anything. And then I would invite you to compare the cost of again, I know some people are kind of concerned about really about the scenario of, can I turn off my SQL Server that I've been running for the last 15 years, right? So I think it's due diligence to really compare the cost of archiving it to like a data lake, and then being able to shut off that server, maybe not, have the IT costs or maintenance costs, or ongoing costs of running that on-premise server. So I think it's just something to factor in on whether it makes sense. But you can see today from this can be a very cost-effective mechanism. And then this is important too, right? I told you I maybe didn't do such a good job because it took me 12 months before I looked at the costs of what we were doing. But it's something that you should take a peek at and just see if there's any anomalies or something like that. Again, if you've set up premium and are seeing a spike here and there or something like that, I think it's just good to look at what those ongoing costs may be. Okay, and maybe just since I mentioned it very briefly, there are 2 more sessions where we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the data lake. So the first one is really how to configure an Azure data lake. So we're going to jump in again, hands-on again. We're going to jump into Azure and we're going to show you how you can get in there and again, some of the same options we talked about today, we're going to really implement and explain a bit deeper tomorrow. And then the third one is going to be getting the most out of your Azure data lake. So that'll be the next session, which is on Wednesday. So Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of this week, we're gonna hammer Azure data lakes and answer all your questions that we can. Okay, so questions again. If you have them, I'd encourage you to use the questions pane. And I know there's a couple out there right now, so let me take a peek. Okay. First question is there any reason that the data capacity would grow if you're only using to access like Dynamics GP archive data? Yeah, in that case, yeah, it's not going to, right, once you have a set amount, again, it's a historical point in time, so it's not going to grow. So I guess once you know how much you're storing, then it's going to stay very, very similar. The only caveat I'd maybe put into that is that we talked about there are times when for performance or again even cost savings is that we may do something called a file split, which allows us to take a really big file and move it into smaller files. And so that could actually, it does increase your storage just a little bit, but again, it optimizes the experience. So again, the storage cost, as you saw, was so minimal. It was cents, and so it doesn't cost us that much more to store duplicate portions of that data. But yep, good question. All right, next question is for the initial data load. Do you see a higher cost for write operations, overages if you're over the 100,000? Again, I'll be really frank with you. I haven't really ran into this too much because, again, even if, well, let me give you a sample scenario. Even if you had 10 GP, I think this is around GP too, but let's say you had 10 GP companies, and if you moved all of the tables in each of those companies, there's probably, I don't know, there's probably close to 2,000 tables or something like that in a company. You're talking about 2,000 times 10, right? So you're talking about 20,000 writes of those tables to the data lake. And then again, if you do the smart lists, you're talking about quite a bit less than that, because most people probably have less than 100 smart lists that they're moving. And so again, you're just looking at such a smaller option. You're not looking at anywhere near 100,000 unless you're getting into, again, more companies or something like that. But the writes for most people they're not causing much. And like I said, even if you had a blip 1 month, right? Maybe the first month as you're moving that data, maybe there's a blip and it goes up $3 or $5 or $10, right? It's going to be pretty cost effective. Okay, this is a really good question. I think a lot of people get caught up on that too. There's a couple options in there, right, on reserving the storage capacity for 3 years. This is a common misconception. It's not really, there's no cost savings to reserving capacity. It actually costs you a lot more to reserve capacity. So why is that there? This is really for people that have huge amounts of data, right? So if you're starting to say, hey, I have 5 petabytes of data that is going to be in here, and I need to make sure that you have the capacity on the server. And so Microsoft may have to basically provision a storage network that can handle larger amounts. But I mean, if you're talking under terabytes or under, you're not going to have any kind of issue whatsoever. So I would say, again, just to kind of reiterate, the reserved storage capacity is really a thing that's actually going to make your costs go up. It doesn't save you any money. It's just Microsoft saying, yeah, we'll reserve this amount of data for you because you have a huge amount. Good question. Oh, here's one. Why should I trust Microsoft to secure my data? That's a really good question, I guess. It is like I said, it's sitting in their storage network. So if you don't trust anything in Azure, then maybe the cloud is not for you. But it's going to be the same for even we haven't talked about this, but Amazon, they have data lakes. There's probably 100 other data lake companies out there where it's basically, again, just a place to store files. So again, I guess that's a personal choice that you need to make on what big companies you trust, but it is certainly something that for people that when they're archiving their data, and it is going to be in each customer's Azure account, right? So it's something that it's not stored in one place. It gets stored on wherever that customer chooses to put it. Good question. Okay, I'm a consultant, not a customer. Would I need to subscribe to Azure if my only goal is to learn how to configure the data lake with E1 PopDoc? And is there a way to extend the trial? Okay, all right, couple things there. Yeah, if you are just looking at digging into it, I'd tell you to sign up for an Azure account. Microsoft actually gives you you can sign up for a free Azure account, and then you can start setting up a data lake inside of there. And I think they give you like $200 for free consumption. So again, if you're only going to be trying it out for a month, like I said, you're gonna spend cents or dollars so on that. So it won't even cost you that because Microsoft gives you like $200 free. The other part is, yeah, I can follow up with you or have someone follow up with you on if we need to extend that trial so that you have access to that in PopDoc. So we'll follow up with you on that specifically and get you that information. Okay, I think that is all the questions that I have for today. So I want to thank everybody for their time. Again, if you do have further questions that you think of after this, I encourage you to send something to sales@e1solutions.com, and we'll hunt down the right people to get you answers on this. But otherwise, I hope to see some of you in the upcoming sessions on the Data Lake in the next couple of days. So thank you for your time today, and we'll see you around. Thanks, everyone.